So it is extremely timely that we turn our attention to our central waterfront. To put tonight in context, there is probably nowhere else in the world where there's such an exciting design opportunity to transform what is a gray and dreary transportation corridor into a vibrant, active, exciting public space. And this project has attracted not only our astounding local talent, but world-renowned national and international design teams. So we're thrilled to hear what they have to say. Good luck to all 4 teams, and thank you again for being here.
I think we're going to have a fabulous evening. You're going to hear from some remarkable teams, and I hope that we can make it worth your while. Let me touch on a few basics about this project. First and foremost, I think we need to take a moment to celebrate the fact that the viaduct is coming down. This is something we've talked about as a city for years, a lot longer than I have been alive, and that it's actually happening is the foundation of this project. What that does is it opens up more than 20 acres of public land that we as a city get to reimagine. What's remarkable about that, especially when we compare Seattle to other American cities, is that nearly all of that land is public, and it will remain public land in perpetuity. This is not a proposal, as we talk about the waterfront, for development. It is primarily about creating place for this city to come together and for people to enjoy the waterfront.
Fundamentally, this project is about 4 things: bringing the water to the city, bringing the city to the water, and in that seam, creating the heart of the city. And finally, to do it in a way that it's a vessel for experience, for culture, for art, for the vibrancy that this community is known for.
So, this is an extraordinary seam in the city, and we want to make it thick. So, in approaching that and approaching the rich ecological function on the shoreline, which must become richer, it is our intent to work with the seawall and bring layers of ecotone transitioning from the shoreline upland. Now, it's our intent that we design thinking about let's see, I'm gonna go forward. Do I go forward here? Pre-development function. But we will have it take an urban form. So ultimately, this will not be, is this forward? That's forward. Sorry, you guys. Sorry about that. So it will not be a linear condition, but instead, it will be this very thick part of the city that goes up into the heart of the city.
And continuing the conversation about merging land and sea, we want to sort of clearly understand that we're not designing only a park or an open space along the waterfront. What we're really doing is designing for multi-sensory experiences and layered levels of engagement of people that is clearly integrated into the downtown via a network of connected pathways. And those pathways run north to south along the waterfront, and we need to make sure that along that pathway that we create a continuity of movement and an intelligible movement that gets you from place to place. At the same time, we need to begin to acknowledge the various neighborhoods that exist along the waterfront and their different character and their different function, and integrate those into the system as well. We also need to look at how we go east-west into the neighborhoods, and that these routes will connect up to other activities within the downtown, including events, open spaces, and not the least of which would be transportation modes, so that we have an integrated regional system. And these routes have to be multimodal, barrier-free, pedestrian-friendly, and just loaded with activity. And finally, there's an east-west a north-south movement that's along the east side of the waterfront itself, and that's all the existing properties and buildings that exist there, as well as the undeveloped land. And we have to make it clear that these properties need to begin to reorient their focus to the waterfront, and that they have entrances and lower-level uses and activities that will help activate the waterfront. So what we are essentially doing is designing a vessel for continuous community civil life.
So I'm the German guy here in this team. And I'm Dieter Graun from Atelier Dreiseidel, from Germany and from Portland. So I was already working for 2 years here in the city. I enjoyed the city and the people here. And I realized immediately that this city and also the mind of the people is really about water. And my role here is, and that's what I enjoy, is really from the big plans, from the framework plans, from the master plans, to break it down to something what each of you can feel, can touch, and can experience. Because this is finally that what brings value, what shapes our society. So what I think, and this would be something completely exciting, if it's raining like it is at the moment outside, that should be a reason to go to the waterfront. And that should be an event at the waterfront. An event where we celebrate our civic space. Our space where we learn how a city which is a hidden sustainable infrastructure, how it's working. But I want to raise also your imagination. Imagine there are spaces where we can contemplate in the midst of an urban, busy city, where culture, art, and finally also design of plazas and parks, where this all melts together to a harmony. That would be a dream, but also to increase, I think, landscape design, parks, plazas, they should be able to increase, to attract people to use those spaces most creatively, to perform for each of you, being able to perform in those spaces. Finally, I think what is most important for us is the future. And the future is about how do we raise the next generation in our cities. And I think we have a responsibility to humanize our cities in a transformation and to look what can we do for our younger generations also in a very urban city. But the Seattle waterfront and the viaduct reminds me to a very moving moment in history in Germany. Some of you might certainly remember 1989, we had the wall, the break of the wall, and the wall in Berlin, the capital of Germany. It was an abandoned space. The wall was dividing people and was dividing and separating the city. It broke down. We had to transform a new civic center, civic spaces. It was a new creation of a new heart of a city society. And the question is how to do that. Is it only shaping building mass, or is it something which should go into the emotional remembrance of the people? It should attach people, and that was a big task, how to bring the soul back to this area. And we decided to do it with water. Water which complements, which brings a main value to this composition with the city. And finally, we got to a space where this composition works. Water, softscape, plants, and buildings to a harmonious picture. But finally, in plazas, integrated water in a way that it touches people, that people can relax and can enjoy very, very urban spaces and can hang out. So. this format?
There are really three aspects to the cultural program. One, to ensure that the thinking of artists is incorporated into the conceptual ideation, the planning, and the design of the waterfront. Two, to create a cultural plan, and we have an extraordinary opportunity here to link that plan to the overarching framework plan that Marshall described earlier on. And finally, three, civic engagement. The art team sort of focused its ideas around this 1970s photograph that Buster Simpson had of a very simple table along the waterfront, and the indigenous adage, when the tide is out, the table is set, which is an illustration of our profound social, spiritual, and economic connection to our environment. So what does this metaphor mean? Well, what it means to us is it's about bounty, it's about resources, it's about connection to place, it's about responsibility and stewardship, and it's about extending an invitation. Seattle has a rich and vibrant, diverse and accomplished, active cultural community. That's the bounty. And that's also the connection to place. And it's clearly the soul of the city. We're also a national leader in the integration of public art into public space. That's a resource. Let's talk a little bit about responsibility and stewardship. How to describe our project artists. These are generous and visionary individuals that actually defy categorization. But they're united in a passionate commitment to living the principles of economic, social, and ecological sustainability. We have Buster Simpson, Rick Lowe from Project Row House, Mel Chin, and now we're going to talk a moment about extending the invitation. Our team has a creative engagement strategist in the form of artist Susan Robb. Susan will set the table for an extraordinary and participatory invitation to come and imagine the waterfront. This quote by Lucia Neary kind of sums up our creative engagement campaign. What if the city dreamed together? What if the city used its collective imagination and creativity to envision a new place? What if the creative engagement strategy was a festival along the waterfront for the duration of the planning and design phases? A festival that could inspire citizens, that could provide creative employment for local artists, that could provide needed momentum, maintain momentum, that could activate the space. In our approach strategy, the art starts now.
We have this illustration of the table to also describe how we see the process occurring. We're going to orchestrate the work around these four major forums or milestones, beginning with one where we really get together and understand the process to this point, what was, then what is, what are the constraints that are real and hard that we need to engage from a design and engineering point of view, and the one we're especially looking forward to is the what if question that Kath was just mentioning, followed by a representation of the ideas as a plan. What if, for example, a portion of this viaduct remained in place, not as a historical evidence, but as a reconstituted piece of this waterfront that allows people a high perch? Maybe you want to get married up there. What if you could recycle the thing and turn it into new opportunities for life in Puget Sound? We know that this is possible, that you can create reefs. Why not use it that way? What if lighting could be done in such a way that it represents kind of the vibrancy, the effects of water, climate, and atmospherics? What if signage could also represent these atmospherics in a way that it's reflective of the light of the sky of the rain? What if you had walls where anyone can write what they want? What if you could go back to the concerts on the pier that have been lost and bring people to the waterfront in a way that really can explain and capture the spectacle of being on the waterfront? This image, these people on the water, reminds me of this image. It's taken in Discovery Park not far from here. As a designer, I look at this and I see the simplicity, the profound beauty of this environment. As an ecological designer, I see richness. I see life and vibrancy in those rocks right there. And this is the promise of the shore. This is the kind of thing that we take as designers to imagine this waterfront as something that is profoundly simple yet beautiful, that captures its working port environment, but that also has the vibrancy, the richness, I think, that we've all envisioned through these images that Kath talks about in terms of the resources of the people of Seattle to enliven that place. And that's our calling, to try and transform this place.
We have a few questions that we'd like to ask you. To begin, how will you address or employ or otherwise acknowledge all the plans and design ideas that have been generated over the past decade for this waterfront? How will you balance respect for that energy and history and still bring a fresh eye to the project?
I think philosophically, as an ethic of design, we are committed to discovering the energy of a place. This is strictly an ecological position of a mindset that says that you can only design things uniquely if you enter the processes at work, whether natural or cultural. And that's basically what we're going to do. We're going to understand that, and it's from that source and that source alone that innovation and creativity can come, not from some other place. I think, as Marshall mentioned, this needs to be an authentic design. And I think we have the methods, the experience to make that happen through this process.
That's a very articulate description of a process. And if you'll permit me, let me bridge on that. Many leading American landscape architects, urbanists, and historians, including J.B. Jackson, Randy Hester, William Morrish, Sarah Williams Goldhagen, have associated good design with democracy. How does your work and your vision for the Central Waterfront embody this idea of design for democracy? And I'd like you to try to answer that through design principles more than a description of process.
Well, I think I'd like some of my teammates to respond to that. I think there's a point in which the designer stands up before people and promotes a vision and an idea. And you have to be convinced personally that you're doing the right thing and that you have the power of communication to sell that. And I can tell you through examples. I'll give you one example. We designed the Georgetown Waterfront Park in Washington, D.C. This is the first and only national park that is an urban waterfront. The people of Georgetown, in their great generosity, contributed funds for this project. And they said to me, we love our brick streets, our red brick streets. This is a tradition of Georgetown, as you all know. We countered to say, well, the difference is that this waterfront was industrial. It was a working waterfront. It wasn't part of the residences that live uphill that had this red brick. You need to think about this heritage and come up with an identity that is reflective of that unique condition. In the end, the pavers were not red. They were industrial asphalt blocks. There were stainless steel railings that were minimal. And there was the kind of grittiness involved in the design that expressed that. It wasn't an easy sell. I have to tell you that we had lots of meetings where even the community was divided about this. But my role as designer was to basically navigate that line, keep the voice clear, and argue for a point that in the end, when it was built, everybody applauds. Dieter, I'm sure you have some thoughts about this.
Yes, I would go in a direction to answer this question with an example the sample. I think it will be for us impossible to convince 100% doesn't matter what we are doing, if we are doing red, blue, or gray, cobblestones or pavers. I can give you an example of a feedback from a project from a city in Germany, a city a little bit smaller than Seattle, but the feedback is, and this has to be seen in relationship to the process. The process was very, very controversial. So we had a lots of movement in the society of the city, and it was a lots of discussion and really a lots of friction in that process about what we are doing in design. It was basically really going to the experience of people on a plaza, on a city plaza. I got last week the feedback that this project is so successful that even in this very difficult economic times, what we have at the moment in Germany, the city is hiring a manager for this plaza because everybody in the city enjoys this plaza because kids, all generations are playing there, they're enjoying that plaza. It's the most successful part in the city. So they invest in that later on. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but this is the experience. So we will get not everybody 100% behind what we propose.
I deeply appreciate your emphasis on the role that identity plays in the relationship between design and democracy. And I think it's fair to say that here in the Pacific Northwest, we derive a significant part of our identity from profound sensitivity to the interdependence of human and natural systems. What is your approach to balancing historically urban working waterfront space with a strong local desire to restore marine ecosystems? And do you have previous experience with a challenge such as this?
Well, I think there's two sides to that question. The first one, I think that Barb touched on in her slides. This is a very ecologically rich environment. And the design of the seawall that will be basically the catalyst for changing that now. And as you know, the team that is selected will have to hit the ground running, working with the seawall team to address that issue. That seawall needs to have diversity, variety to encourage the ecotonal kinds of ecological processes that can bring that ecological richness to the immediacy of the urban waterfront. These things are not mutually exclusive, even in a working environment. I mean, there are ways to calibrate wave movement, wave action with the environments that you create to promote aquatic life. And we're eager to talk to those consultants to begin to address this idea of a variety of conditions along the waterfront for ecological reasons, but also to get people close to the waterfront. We discussed this in today's interview as a team. It was one of the questions that was asked. And I think we all felt that one of the reasons that this can be an authentic waterfront is to really embrace and in fact make dramatic the fact that this is a working waterfront. Not kind of a simple, necessarily devoid of that gritty richness that makes this place what it is. Seeing boats come by, seeing boats dock, the ferry included, is something that is just powerful to see the water churning. Right now it's not that easy to sort of get proximate, create the kinds of perches or balconies or approaches where people can really feel this. So if you combine that need for drama related to the waterfront with the idea of a rich ecological response to the edge, I think you have the answer to your question.
Very good. This question is from a member of our audience. Could you explain what the different types of gathering that will happen in your vision of the waterfront, such as performance, commerce, exchange, and in this question, the word gathering is in scare quotes.
Thank you. This is perhaps the most interesting question to us because Marshall mentioned this is about 20 plus acres of a space, right? And it has to have walkways, promenade, a boulevard, all kinds of pressures put on what in reality is not a big space if you think of the great waterfronts of the world. So how to calibrate the space to first understand exactly the dimensions that you need to make this work. And we have, for example, on our team, Atkins consultant from London, who specialize in walkable environments, so that we know exactly how many of you will want to go at any specific point to the waterfront and what would it take to get you there in a way that's safe and entertaining. But beyond that, I think that we will discover through the planning process opportunities, as I mentioned, for concerts on the pier, all kinds of things that can happen there. The answer, we feel, is to think of this space as a flexible space. There are many cities, for example, that close roads on their waterfronts and create walkathons or create different performances, different things. Kath has mentioned an art program that could be part of this. You could have ephemeral works that can enrich the experience throughout the year. But I think there's one thing that we cannot forget. No matter how much we program and plan every square foot of this 20 acres, somebody in this audience, in this city, will come up with a program that we haven't thought about later, years after it's built. And that may, in fact, be the identity of the waterfront, things that we haven't imagined. So having the sense of an open book that is written over time, I think, is a fundamental thing that we have to think about as designers. Dennis?
I think there's the time element as well. Is this working? I guess not. It is. Thank you. The time element as well, where we have seasonal activities going on in Seattle, where spaces can be designed for multiple uses over time. And they can perform, say, functional, direct commercial activities during some part of the season, like the cruise ships and the access to the cruise ships. But in the off-season, those spaces can be used for other activities that can be planned throughout the year. And so I think that the notion that we're going to design specific spaces for specific activities along the waterfront is probably not the right idea. What we want to design are spaces that have multiple uses and that can transform themselves to accommodate the multisensory kind of activities that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you.
Just bridging on that vivid description, of course, the city of Seattle has vibrant public space already. To the extent that the vision for the development of the central waterfront begins to suggest a necklace of powerful urban centers, including the Seattle Art Museum's award-winning Olympic Sculpture Park, further to the north, Seattle Center, even South Lake Union, and all the adjacent trails for walkers and bicycle users. Extending the discussion that we've just had on your development or vision for this site, how would you begin to make intelligible connections to those other important public amenities in the city?
I think I have less than a minute left, but basically that's the charge of the framework plan. The framework plan will address the neighborhoods, who lives there, what are their demands, how do you connect to the larger network from a transit point of view, complete street point of view. And one of the things that's really dear to my heart is the idea of living streets. Not just complete streets, but streets that at the neighborhood scale provide a level of sociability, ability for people to meet, to play, without necessarily having to think that you have to go a quarter of a mile to the waterfront. So the passage from the neighborhood to the waterfront is something that we're going to be focused on very, very, very strongly.
And also we have, as mentioned earlier, Atkins consulting firm on our team, and they've developed evidence-based analysis systems that begin to look at how people interact with space throughout a network, and they can begin to assess how one space relates to another space and how all those spaces relate to themselves over time to help communicate a system that's highly intelligible and forms a basis for some of the design elements that Ignacio mentioned.
One final question, and it's almost unfair because you have about 1 minute and 30 seconds. But in your best work, how has the public process that you began with shaped the outcome of your design thinking?
Oh, in absolutely fascinating and unpredictable ways. That is the truth.
It's my great pleasure to welcome James Corner, Field Operations.
Let me tell you, I am absolutely personally committed to this project. This is the kind of project I believe I was educated for and have trained and practiced for. It's the kind of project that is what our practice wants to do. Seattle is a wonderful city. It's a global city, and the whole possibility of bringing the city to the waterfront in a world-class and 21st century way is exactly what we want to do. So it's a hallmark of commitment that we're here this evening. This is a photograph of the city I was born in and lived in England, Manchester. I don't know how many of you know it, but it's not unlike Seattle. It's tough, it's real, it's working. It's typically shrouded in clouds and rainfall, like you guys are. So I'm accustomed to the weather. But not too far out of the city is the countryside, and that relationship of nature to city, urban to landscape, is very strong in Manchester, and as it is in Seattle. When I first came to the US in the late 1980s, I wanted to learn more about the American landscape and flew across the country with a aerial photographer colleague of mine. We took several trips across the country, photographing and trying to understand the American landscape, the big grid landscape of the Midwest, very quickly becoming the sort of irrigated landscape of the West, with the big pivot irrigators. These are the wonderful wheat field strips in Montana. And here you have eastern Washington with the big wheat fields of your state, which are just magnificent in terms of scale, magnitude, and grandeur. There's Mount Rainier sticking out of the clouds, and as you descend down the mountain, you come into the Puget Sound and then into Elliott's Bay. That is the frontage of Seattle. And here's the waterfront, but what strikes me as being very important is the fact that this is a working waterfront. It's tough. It's just like Manchester. It's just like the real world. I really hate waterfronts that are anesthetized and beautified to the point of looking like every other city. I think there are characteristics here to do with scale, working, manufacturing, the life of the port, the life of the ferries and the boats on the water that are really critical. Secondly, the fact that the city, to me, always feels like it's immersed in weather. The clouds, the mists, the fogs, these are really extraordinary phenomena. They play with light, they imbue a culture with a sense of place, and they surround the city, they immerse the city in this sort of ambient moodiness and melancholy of a very, very dynamic, big nature. This is a photograph looking from one of the streets across the bay, and it's not too far before you get to big nature, which is another characteristic of the Northwest and of Seattle. The fact that you guys have massive nature right on your front door, and you're a health and fitness culture, as well as an alternative culture. I love the fact that there's a very strong, and has been a very strong, youth culture in Seattle. A lot of energy, a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity. Thread is the new hot thing located in Seattle. And of course, that leads to a very vibrant street life, very vibrant neighborhoods, and more recently, a progressive sense of design and architecture with the Seattle Library and the Sculpture Park. And what a wonderful beginning with the Sculpture Park in terms of how the city can meet its waterfront in a new and fresh way. We call this Seattle's front porch. It's where the people of Seattle can have a new address, a new destination, a new frontage. The project, we could break it down very simply to say that there is the issue of it being a corridor, what this new green corridor could be, accommodating a new street, obviously lots of trees and plantings and water features and public spaces. The seawall that's being rebuilt does not have to be a dead straight wall. It can actually turn inland and outland and be modified to optimize opportunities for social interaction with the water. The piers are very distinctive. We want to find a way to activate their perimeters and to get people out on the piers and having a bigger sense of the bay. The little bays in between the piers offer a different sort of landscape from when you move out into the bigger bay. And of course, most important perhaps are the connections that lead you back into the downtown, and really are the connections and the links that connect the downtown to the waterfront, and how to give those a sense of civic scale, generosity, and movement, and celebrate something about the topographic issues of moving from one level to the other. And finally, the frontages. These buildings, which presently have very modest frontages or programs, could become much more animated. You could imagine these one day vibrant with cafes and restaurants and shops, and really helping to animate the economy of the waterfront. I want to say 4 things very quickly against the clock here. The first is our commitment and our creativity with regards to creating a fantastic public realm. This is the big challenge here. How the Seattle waterfront can be a spectacular, extraordinary, 21st century, world-class, original and unique public space. We did this in New York, I believe, with the High Line, which is this elevated rail track running through the west side of Manhattan. Once a rail track turned into a meadow. Now a spectacular public promenade with hundreds, if not thousands, of visitors daily, many of them local residents, but also a good mix of visitors to the city. I believe that the design works because it has a sort of immediate recognizable presence. It dramatizes how you can actually enter a public space, the whole idea of gateways and entries and movement. When you come onto the High Line, you're confronted with this truly extraordinary, unusual landscape. It's designed for promenading, for movement, for meandering. There's a special choreography whereby views and vistas open up and unusual perspectives of the city are taken. It's about vegetation, where people engage with vegetation, often wild vegetation in a very sort of moving and imaginative and creative way. And it has to do with the creation of settings for people. And this is a big message we want to leave you with for the Seattle waterfront. Our job is to make dramatic settings where you can all come out onto your front porch, if you will, and enjoy one another's company, but take in the spectacle of life. This window that we created is very popular on the High Line. It's where people are framed. It's where people look out into the street in a new way. And it becomes a sort of an amphitheater, enormously popular with families, with people of diverse ages. Lighting can be very dramatic. It can really make existing spaces look fantastic and feel new and fresh. And furniture becomes very important. Not your usual park bench, but here, overscaled sun lounges where people can face the sun and meet friends and behave in some ways legal and some ways questionable, but that's public life. And here's two young girls who wanted to put towels down right in the middle of the path. Well, Parks Department would have something to say about that, but these are people appropriating public space in a free and wonderful way. Lots of opportunities for viewing and for little children to have a tactile relationship with what they find. These are other examples from other projects around the world where cities are reaching down to touch the water. What a wonderful sort of overscaled piece of urban furniture this is, which allows you to get down and touch the water. These steps go down into this pool. This is interesting. It's a kind of a sea wall, if you like, but it has steps and seating and overlooks and interior nooks and crannies, which bring an awful lot of social possibility for seating and for interaction. These kids are jumping off into the pool here, or these ones are actually climbing in the harbor. So we have a commitment to the public realm. What we offer you is a vision for furnishing and setting up and creating very dramatic and extraordinary settings for social life. The second issue is green urbanism. Cities around the world are beginning to work with greenery, with the environment, with ecology, with sustainability. This is a project we have won the competition for in China. It's for a city that is half the size of Manhattan and is just as dense. One of the features of this design I want to just signal to you are these big green linear fingers. They're actually originally small tributaries and rivers that are quite polluted. And so we're creating these new green ribbons and sculpting them in a very sort of dramatic and sculptural and artistic way. They're designed partly as parks. They have paths and public spaces. But more importantly, they're water treatment machines, biological machines at a massive scale, where these flood waters are being contained, worked through a series of holding basins and terraces and levels, and by the time the water gets to the bay, it's 100% clean. So it's this idea of creating a green city, and there are many other examples of green cities historically, but more so in the sense of parks and gardens. This is a green city where it's ecological infrastructure, green infrastructure. And I see the possibility here in Seattle, because of the culture and the society and the ambitions, that there could be more here than just great public space. There could be significant ecological improvement that is actually a model for the world. And when we talk about these big things, don't forget the little things. This little crab is actually a critical ingredient in terms of those very large-scale ecological infrastructures working. And I think it's really important to remember the big scale and the small scale. The third point I want to make is the importance of early wins. I do not want to wait around 10 or 15 or 20 years for you guys to have a brand new waterfront. And I'm sure you don't either. So what can we do tomorrow that signals change and transformation? It could be as simple as putting a picnic table or a chair out there so you can actually sit and take in the view. It could be, in this project at Fresh Kills, we built this viewing tower, which is a modest investment. It elevates people to get to a whole new level and take in the site. Signage. We have these seed packets that people can take seed from the site and distribute seed around the community. We have tree planting programs. You could imagine closing the road for a weekend, as they did here in Toronto, and have a family bicycling day. Or close the road, just like they did in the Champs-Élysées here in Paris, and build these temporary gardens. And the fourth and final point I want to make is about public engagement. This is your park. This is your waterfront. We have a commitment to engaging you, to elevating your imaginations, to provoking your own sense of what is possible, to encouraging innovation, and to delivering real excellence that you are proud of, that you recognize your own voice in, and that you enjoy. We do this in all our projects. This happens to be in Memphis. There's Lisa and I meeting with some kids. We like to make people very engaged and interactive. They make drawings, they make models, they distribute things around the site. This project in Philadelphia, we had a large number of public meetings, and I'm going to skip fast here. I simply want to make the point that the public meetings that we led, because they were directed in a certain way, allowed us to actually produce a fairly radical and interesting design. It was not public process that led to bland, watered-down product. It was public process that produced something extraordinary on a low budget, too. This pier is designed as a sort of topographic sky ramp. It's being built now. And it offers a very broad range of diverse social settings in a small space. And finally, Jay, please, we spent the past couple of days interviewing some of you on the waterfront, and we have a recording here. We'd like to play back to you some of your citizens in terms of what their own desires, dreams, ambitions, aspirations might be for the waterfront.
you want to buy some food or something.
The sidewalks get packed. Open areas without the viaduct might allow for more breathing room for people. Spaces to enjoy one another's company.
I would like to see public space.
Definitely some nature. It would really help, I think, the environment, the air. It would attract also, a lot more family oriented, so it won't be so urban in a sense, even though it's around an urban area.
Maybe a promenade. I thought it was a great idea. And it would be a great idea also to integrate, the bicycles into the waterfront as well. Take advantage of the fact that we have water right here downtown. I mean, how many people can say in the downtown of their city we got, the sound, some water, some ferries coming in. So
Quite a menu of things we look forward to helping you create, some of them, if not more of them, on your waterfront. Thank you.
Obviously, this project has a huge transportation component. Bridging on some of the images that we've seen in your presentation tonight, could you please briefly describe your team's approach to integrating public transit, bicycle, and pedestrian transportation facilities and vehicular traffic into the design of public space?
Yes, I mean, this will be a big issue because when the Alaska Way comes down, there will be a new street that is built. And we would hope that this street is actually integrated with the park, that it's not a typical street, but it's actually a 21st century street that humanizes vehicular traffic, prioritizes the pedestrian, and really promotes bicycles and pedestrian movement and promotes accessibility and freedom of movement. All of this has to be very carefully designed. We've done this in Toronto, for example, where the Gardner Expressway, which is a similar elevated structure, the plan is to remove it and to build an at-grade street, reducing something like 16 lanes to 6 lanes. Those lanes need to have new intersections, new pedestrian crossings, and be completely reimagined so that the waterfront is, public, and it's about people, and it's about pedestrians. So we have experience in this area. I don't know if Lee wants to add something, but we know there has to be a street here, and for us, it's a priority that the street is integral to the park.
I would like to add one other point, and that is that the new street will also connect with the east-west connections into downtown and into Belltown, into Pioneer Square, and those, particularly the pedestrian activity that will occur there and the connection to the new street will become really critical, and I think a very integral part of the whole design concept for the waterfront in the future.
The name Seattle and the name of many of the town's natural features and waterways and water bodies that give our region its distinct characteristics embody our debt to the First Nations that settled this area, and they are always on our mind. In respect of your vision for a 21st century street and a 21st century waterfront, what would your approach be to incorporating the rich histories of Native Americans in the Seattle area, and what is your experience in working with ethnic communities to understand and reflect cultural elements in a design?
It's a very good question. I think our philosophy is that, for us, every project has to be unique to its place, to its culture, to its history, to its location. The High Line is a very unique project. We will not duplicate that here. There's a totally different set of issues, a totally different set of parameters. You mentioned specifically ancient, historical, important cultures. We have in Lake Ontario Park in Toronto, the Native American Indian tribes that used to live on the shorelines there are actually a very important voice in terms of how that park is being shaped. Even in Santa Monica in Los Angeles, where we're building a park, there's a very strong Native American contingent and set of voices and a set of ideas. But I think in both experiences that I've had with both those groups of Native Americans, they actually have an extraordinarily apt and positive sense of the contemporary, right? They don't ask that their culture be somehow made nostalgic. They're actually quite contemporary. For example, one of the Native American chiefs in Toronto is very impressed that the teenagers come down to drink beer at night and they play trance music because the beat, the drum beat of the trance music is resonates with his tribe's sense of music. So he now hangs out with the 18-year-olds smoking pot and drinking beer on the waterfront. So I would say that, you know, we want to engage these different cultures, but I think there's, you know, also at the same time a sense of not overly sentimentalizing the story, but actually bringing it into a current sense of the contemporary. I don't know if Guy, as a local Seattle person, would add to that.
Well, the one thing I would just add is that I think the history of our waterfront is one of the real opportunities. I think the history we see there now, we have to remember is sort of one-dimensional, and it's just a very recent part. And so I think exactly embracing the whole of our history, natural history, pre-contact, things like that is a real exciting opportunity.
Given your conspicuous affiliation with the University of Pennsylvania, you will doubtless recognize the thought process of the architectural theorist David Leatherbarrow, who described architecture and the city as a sedimentation of habits. Not all habits are good habits. What habits, if any, will your design target for change, and why?
Wow, that's... This is a public meeting, Ted.
You opened the question with those pictures of the High Line.
Not an academic symposium, but so you're asking me about the sedimentation of habits, and right? I mean, I think what you're maybe alluding to is the fact that, you know, when we design public space, it's really about setting up the stage or the theater for the performance of civic life. It's for people to actually come out and enjoy the company with others, some of whom they know and are friends with, and some of whom they're coming out to meet and make new friends and new relationships. So this term, perhaps the sedimentation of habits, is really the fact that the great cities that we all probably love, you know, you go to Rome, for example, because of its layers of history and the layers of accumulative habit, the sedimentation of habit, different people using public space in very vibrant and very compelling and very diverse range of ways is what makes us excited about being in those cities. So in my view, the conversion of a post-industrial waterfront in Seattle is maybe about trying to think of settings, stages, backdrops, accommodations, furnishing, setups, encounters in such a way that people can come out and have wonderful experiences. Experiences as an individual, experiences as a family, experiences as a collective, and experiences meeting new people. So for us, I tried to say it in passing, but you know, the design of great public space isn't just about making it look good. It's really about setting it up so social life can be really wonderful, dramatic, and theatrical. Maybe Greg, I could ask Greg to talk to this because his work on the East Esplanade in New York as well as the Seaport, a lot of that has been about the performance of public life.
I think that that's actually one of the reasons that shop and field ops work so well together, that it's not just the design object, it's really about the performance of space and understanding how architecture, design, landscape, and public space interact so that these performances unfold in different ways. And it's, of course, it's beautiful, it's art, it's something that inspires you, but it's not about the object first, it's about what it does, not what it looks like. And it's one of the reasons that we just love working together.
Thanks very much. I had in mind, and I think you've answered this indirectly, how the great spaces that you create help attack the alarming percentage of obesity in our cities, and how they help teach young people that they have legs. But clearly your images and your answers have addressed that. This next question comes from our audience tonight. Jane Jacobs is very critical of disused public spaces. How do you keep public spaces active and therefore safe and vibrant? And perhaps that's your last answer is a perfect segue into this. Maybe you can use examples from past designs to help illustrate your answer.
Sure, it's a very good question, and a lot of our projects around the world, the same questions are being asked. People are worried about safety, they're worried about visibility, and in the design stage, the client group is worried about whether anyone will come and whether all of this design investment might be made and no one will come. Well, when we first started the High Line, they were worried that no one would come. That it seemed to be far on the west side of town, that it was perceived to be a very derelict, ugly, post-industrial steel and concrete structure. It would be difficult to get up from the street 30 feet up onto the elevated structure. The stairways were narrow, you know, good design overcomes these sorts of concerns by, again, theatricalizing and opening up public space as something that is visible, inviting, welcoming, comfortable. There are good ingredients. I mean, trees. People like trees, the shade and the seasonality. Water features are often very attractive, especially if you can interact with them, not just a water fountain to look at. Furniture that is really creatively arranged so that people can sit in a variety of different ways and interact in different ways. Really effective lighting that helps to dramatize and make the place look beautiful but also safe. There are tactics and techniques that we know will create great places.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Corner, Field Operations and Team. With that, it's a great pleasure to introduce our next team of presenters, led by Michael Van Valkenburg Associates.
So one of the ways that we think we approach landscape differently, or it defines the way that we do it, is that we see all landscape as having what architects call program, and that begins a way in public meetings for a different kind of conversation to happen when we're sitting around with, you know, some of you certainly, and neighbors and others who want to talk about their aspirations in the landscape. But I think what's unique about what we do is we put it together when we start making the framework plan and the subsequent design in a slightly different way. And so in the 20th century, the paradigm was that pieces of the landscape and pieces of urbanism were kind of carved out separately. And we take an approach that's much more synthetic. We feel like that's really important in Seattle on this site, given the kind of physical constraints of the site, but also the fact that Seattle is this amazing American city that still has a grit and a soul. I mean, you actually, when you come to Seattle, feel an identity that feels like it belongs to Seattle, and it's, you know, not something on the television set. And we feel that the landscape that is made on the waterfront somehow has to not be too pretty and not be something that would, you know, attract a lot of rich people living in condominiums to move down there, but in a more significant way, connect Seattle west to east, down the hill, and east to west. I'm on the other coast now. But bringing people down the hill to the waterfront and to the water. So I wanted to quickly, somebody should be doing time. How are we doing over there? Anybody watching? 11 minutes? Who said that? Are you the person that's gonna like shoot me or trip me or tip me over or something? Okay. So the next selection of images are examples of projects of my office principally that have been built in the last 10 years. We've only selected places that are in public, and this is our Brooklyn Bridge Park this summer on movie night. We say that one of the things that the Seattle waterfront should aspire to is for places of assembly. We all know, we've all heard today the story about the music pier and, you know, the little marine insects that have made that difficult. But places for relaxation, our Hudson River Park, and places for recreation. This is the very first time that kayaks have been launchable in the East River, and part of Brooklyn Bridge Park lets recreation people with those boating skills actually find their way into the water. Places of gathering, that's a very important thing for the waterfront to give back. Places of movement, places for markets and understanding the metrics, and if we get to that point where programmatically we think that's essential, holding the meetings with the people who will be the vendors and understanding what their needs are. We feel very strongly that Seattle would be improved if there were pieces of nature somehow woven back into this. This is our remaking of a salt marsh in Brooklyn Bridge Park. Places for exploration, places for tots, places for families, places for teens, and places for all. One of the things that we always do is get ourselves very invested in the history of the site, not to copy things from the past, but to, in a more profound way, understand its physical evolution. And you guys kind of take the prize for earth moving. We think NIMBYism started here. That guy who came out of his house and thought he was going to have the paper on his front step was really bummed out. This is an example of us doing that in Brooklyn, which the Brooklyn waterfront, it shares many similar aspects of history, except your waterfront is still a vibrant, working waterfront, and the depth of the East River meant that boats could no longer reach those waters, so the piers were abandoned. We had to address issues of sound, and we had to reconceive of the edge between the water and the park. And one of the things that we think is really important is intervening and thinking at the scale of infrastructure, not just because there are pieces of infrastructure that will be changing, but to actually suggest that the landscape and the urban places that are made are also thought of as a kind of system. This is an example of us doing that in Pittsburgh, a photograph from 1994, and our office creating the framework plan, taking those urban systems apart, moving highways as part of it, and then this is that same view where the parking was around 1999. And you can see that one of the things we did, we couldn't get around the base of the river, and so we worked with our engineers to create a cantilever around the base of the river, move the roads on the upper level, created spaces like this where nothing like that had previously existed. I've already said we want to strengthen the connection to the waterfront, but a very critical part of that is recognizing that actually across the north-south length of this site, there's a very dramatic shift of topography on the east side. And we think that that's one of the really fecund moments in this as a design project. Down at Pioneer Square, you come in almost dead level, and by the time you get to the other end, they could remake Vertigo at that site. You literally are looking down, and that might be seen as a challenge, but we think it's one of the really defining qualities of Seattle, and it's a very rich thing to think about. And then there's the issue of connecting to the water. The Sculpture Park does that fantastically. We did something similar in Brooklyn with the piers, and I wanted to say that the way that we got there was through something that engineers call elegant frugality, and that's that you actually work with the engineering team to understand where the structural weaknesses are, and rather than replacing the marine systems, which we've pretty much learned will then subsequently need to be replaced, we chose those as a moment where we used a technique from civil engineering of creating stone gradients and ways for people to get down. This is an example of that in the salt marsh
that we created. That's, of course, Manhattan across the way there. One of the most important things about this whole assignment is that when the road comes down to the street level, it has a civic amenity, whether you want to think of it as a boulevard or not. But we think the really important place for us to work with the Team B that would do that is in the places where the pedestrian crosses. There has to be sovereignty to pedestrians, and people on bicycles have to be equally accommodated. We've gone through a project very similar to that in Toronto in the Portlands project that I mentioned a minute ago, and these are all of our drawings and studies that are currently underway there. And this is an example of us building segment 5 of Hudson River Park next to the bikeway on the West Side Highway, which, by the way, was an elevated highway in the past. We have a strong background in ecological urbanism and especially in water harvesting through our master plan here in Seattle for the Rainier Vista, and a similar example in Brooklyn where we harvest all the rainwater and provide 85% of the irrigation needs that are required on that site. We constructed all the furniture in Brooklyn Bridge Park from wood that was harvested out of buildings that were taken down, and many of the elements, like these stairs, were created with recycled granite. We've been collaborating with artists for a long time. These are some examples, and I'm going to ask Jamie to come up here and say a few words about his work.
So as the artist is part of the plan and organizing the master plan, I think that we really see sort of the need to have a very deep ecological sort of principle in the basis of selecting artists to work on the project, and really engage the public with a more experiential approach to qualities of the phenomenology of nature that exist here in Seattle, which is so unique about this particular city. Qualities of water, qualities of mist, qualities of atmosphere, and certainly qualities of light.
A critical part of what we would commit to do is to not lose sight of the fact that Seattle already has 10 years of really important groundwork, and I'm sure dozens of meetings that some of you have attended, and that our outreach method would use something that is unique to our office, which is the creation of large study models that we would bring to public meetings. And this is a picture of Matt Urbanski, the other principal who would work on the project with me, doing that at Brooklyn Bridge Park. Digital and printed outreach would be critical. And I'd like to end by talking about the form of governance. We certainly have learned from our very wise local team that there are a lot of contradictions or ambivalences about open space because some of it has had a checkered history of being maintained here. And one of the things that we have significant experience is, while creating a framework and a design, also calculating the maintenance cost and figuring out a way in advance what the model of governance would be for taking care of the park. So that it's sort of, I've said this before, but it's not so hard usually to have kids unless you're trying to when you're 50. But taking care of children and raising them is significantly more challenging. And that's so true in a landscape. It's a living medium, and it's very critical that we would imagine how it would be taken care of.
Michael, last month, New Republic architecture critic Sarah Williams Goldhagen wrote, this is a quote, "When politicians, philanthropists, and journalists consider how their work might advance the cause of social justice, they typically do not speak the language of design." Bridging on your sensitivity to the administrative and economic realities of successful landscape urbanism, could you please share with us the kind of conversation you might have with leaders who hold this view?
I think that the most important way to construct any conversation about landscape is not so different between a politician or a philanthropist or a person that would be in the audience, really. And it's important to speak very directly and immediately about the kind of experiences that one imagines that a landscape would have. That I think that one of the things that is the most important thing for the framework plan to do is to comprehensively collect and protect into the future a kind of heterogeneity of experiences, and it really shouldn't be guided by an aesthetic sensibility, but more of a plurality and a sense of democracy in the city. And that's really what would be learned through the public process.
Good enough, good enough. I was hoping for something just a little longer to give me time to prepare the next question, but I'm ready. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Should I talk a little more softly? Coleman Dock is an unusually large element in the central waterfront, and the new design is going to need to incorporate this structure. How will your approach to this problem incorporate the design opportunities represented by Coleman Dock?
I'll take that one up very quickly. I think I'm picking up here. I've worked extensively on the studies and the thinking of future replacement of the Coleman Dock. There's a lot of opportunities there. It's a very large piece of overwater coverage. There's issues regarding proposed plans to put more parking over the water. We've heard a lot of disagreement in Seattle over that. But it's clear that eventually that facility is going to need to be replaced. It needs to be thought out very thoroughly and be a very key part in terms of its location and its impact on the Seattle, on the downtown, on the waterfront, on the fact that it brings 10 million passengers through as a porthole into downtown currently, and could bring many more, but we hope not more cars in the future, perhaps less cars, and that we have something that's iconic, that's beautiful, and that respects the landscape and the harbor and its natural beauty in the future.
And here is another question from our audience tonight. Some of us, natives even, tend to hibernate in the rainy months. How can you get us out in public spaces? How can you make it attractive for us year-round?
Well, I'd like to answer that. I think I'm wired. I'd like to answer that. I think one of the key things that we can do with the program relative to the framework for artists is to establish works by artists who, in fact, might address the seasonal changes that will occur within the whole waterfront area. As we sort of know, to the south, we have much lower grade, there's much steeper grade to the north. All of those opportunities to have works that provide views, provide some limited degree of shelter, and particularly light. How do we bring light into this newly revealed landscape that's been in shadow for so many years? How do you transform that whole opportunity to have light open up that part of the city? So,
Teeing off from Paul Goldberger's observation about your work, Michael, that you have an uncanny ability to feel the bones of a place. There's a strong interest in Seattle in reusing structures in new and creative ways. What are your thoughts on the potential for reimagining portions of certain elements in the waterfront landscape today, such as Battery Street Tunnel, or even parts of the Alaskan Way Viaduct as part of a new design?
We were talking about that today when we were touring the site, and I certainly see that as a possibility, but I also feel that it falls a little bit into the paradigm of the century behind us, where thinking about form and physicality before working out the kind of social and structural in the urban sense of a project is imagined. So it's definitely on the table for us as a possibility. I think it could be extremely interesting, but I also think that ideas like that are just one of many that the public process and the kind of consensus process through one creates a framework plan that this would be considered and weighed. But I also want to say that a very critical part of imagining this project in this kind of post-boom time that we live in is a calculated and ongoing consideration of not only the construction cost of certain decisions, but the maintenance costs. And this would be very significant over time. As if, for instance, the capital cost of Brooklyn Bridge Park is $350 million. The annual cost of maintenance is close to 16. And you can see in a quite short period of time, the maintenance cost equals and then in perpetuity exceeds over and over again the capital cost. And having a kind of, I think one of that quality of grittiness in simplicity that I think will make the resulting project fit here comes along with a frugality about whether those elements are kept or not.
Thank you very much. In addition to the potential of the Central Waterfront, which is poised to transform the quality of life in downtown Seattle, there's an existing system of highly successful urban amenities, including the Seattle Art Museum's Olympic Sculpture Park, Seattle Center, and South Lake Union. How do you feel the role of the Central Waterfront, given its specific niche in the city and its fabric, will connect to the overall network of public space in the city?
I'm going to have Alan take a pass at that.
Okay. We did a drawing for the presentation. Unfortunately, it's not here. But when you look at each of those assets along the waterfront, it's hard to really sense their adjacency to one another. And the fact that Benaroya Hall is right above the aquarium, and the cultural part of the city is so close to the waterfront, but you're not aware of it. And so the idea all along the waterfront, there's adjacencies that will, once it's taken down, will be an incredible energy created between those parts. And that's one of the things that Michael said, is that building large models, visualizing it, getting people involved, and getting input from the public in terms of understanding those relationships now, before the viaduct comes down, is incredibly important.
Speaking of Pacific Northwest transportation infrastructure, the project to design the Central Waterfront has a huge transportation component, obviously. Could you please briefly describe your approach to integrating public transit, bicycle, and pedestrian transportation facilities and vehicle traffic into the design of public space? And feel free to use examples from past projects to illustrate.
An established policy of streets for all modes, complete the streets. I worked on that when I was on the city council. We must fulfill that policy in physical terms someday, when our street right-of-ways, which comprise as much as 40% of the land area of the city of Seattle today, designed primarily for transportation, not necessarily for cars originally, maybe horse-drawn wagons and foot, and at one time one of the largest streetcar systems in the United States. Regrettably, we've lost that infrastructure. We can bring some of it back, and we can provide safe means for all modes: pedestrians, bicycles, skateboards, if you will, and yes, transit. And the waterfront, one of the things that it lacks today is it is really not served by transit at all today. And think about the 10 million passengers coming on the ferry, through the ferry system, again, built for highways and cars predominantly, and no opportunity to make an easy transition by foot off the ferry onto local transit, regional transit, and all modes of travel. So there's work to be done there, clearly, but this is a golden opportunity to rethink those infrastructure issues.
I just want to add one other thing to that. I lived a long time in Boston. In fact, I worked for Kevin Lynch when he was involved in the early 80s in the taking down of the Central Artery, as we called it in Boston, and the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which is not a total success. as a place. And I'm sure that I'm not surprising some of you in the audience to say that, because many feel that way. But the mistake that was made was that traffic engineers were given too much power. And basically the landscape architect came back to do what we call parsley around the pig, or in this case, parsley around the turning lane, rather than pushing back for the kinds of spaces that people want to live in. And it could have had a very different outcome. And I think that the plan that has been imagined, whoever is selected on Team A will actually be involved in the interview process of selecting the traffic engineers, and there will be all along the way, if you will, their plan and our plan coming up together. In the end, this all comes down to the limited amount of space that's down there and vying for the metrics of widths of lane, turning radiuses, how much do pedestrians need, how much do bicycles need. So it's going to be very much, I think, a better outcome in Seattle.
A thoughtful answer. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Van Valkenburg, Associates and team. Ladies and gentlemen, Gustafson, Guthrie, Nickel, and team.
Civic space in Seattle. We think it's important to start by talking about the peculiarities of civic space in Seattle. I kind of talked about Pugitopianism a little bit a second ago, and we only have 20 minutes, but we do know what civic space isn't in Seattle. It's not about the one-liner, one vision, one theory, one scale kind of space that's a monument to that city scale. In fact, we like public and we like public spaces, but we like them to feel more personal and almost anti-monumental. Informal, as if they sort of occurred on accident, even though it takes great artistry to allow that to happen. And we're the leading city in the world for our P-Patch program, which takes public space and divides it into individual, almost privatized plots. And we love that, and it actually brings people together, that sort of accrued individualism. And even our public spaces that don't involve vegetables are really charming collages, at least the most beloved ones are charming collages that sort of felt like they were made by people walking by. That stuff happens over a long period of time, as do the most beloved waterfronts in the world. So how do we create something on this waterfront that has that Seattle sense of informality and personal scale, and the sense of having evolved over a long period of time? How do we design that in a pretty short period of time? Well, contextualism is the answer. It ranges from revealing history, like we did in Venice, when it's there, and when it's not there, it's about bringing in local materials, like we did in Chicago at Millennium Park's Lurie Garden, about bringing in local ecology in the Lurie Garden. This is about reintroducing Chicago to its native prairie landscape. And it's also about doing sometimes kind of common sense things. Leslie and I and Lead Pencil Studio did this at Theater Commons in Seattle Center, where we basically extended a neighborhood street straight across Mercer Street into and through Seattle Center as a very simple precedent and framework for change. Jones & Jones is masterful at designing in the Pacific Northwest natural context and connecting people to it. Lead Pencil Studio is a pair of artists that many of you know. Their work is astonishingly contextual. Not only will they be the art master planners for this project, they also are our conceptual partners at the table. And we've had a great time so far getting prepared for this with them, including the piece you saw at the opening. So about this healthy bay, healthy city, and this inverted diagram of public space, one of the things that sort of kind of blew me away and changed my whole view on where I live was reading about the daily life of Native Americans that lived here before us. And instead of mowing down the hills and cutting the trees to try to find light and space and help their vitamin D deficiencies, they actually used the water, which is flat, it's open, as their ways of connecting with each other. They got up in the morning, went out on the water and did things, and came back to the edge. And of course, they used other parts of the land as well, but how can we learn from them so we're not battling the natural tendency of our landscape to be treed and thick and hilly, and use that open space of that water? And that water is public, so all of us should be using it more. The good news is we have great bones to start with, that we're so close to having this happen. We don't have a center point of our city that's bound by land as if we would if it was flat. Our streets just take us right to the water. There's just a little bit of a void there. They're all perpendicular. So we have these ingredients that are so close to merging in a really interesting way, but we have that void space. And what we have to be very careful of with this project is the temptation to redo this mistake by coloring that void space green. That's not the way the edges work. What we're talking about is sort of releasing that tension and simply allowing the streets to extend and the bay to be drawn into the city and touch each other without that third space. What that will do is create interest in two directions that we don't have right now in the waterfront. Number one, we'll have extremely strong street connections to the bay so that that waterfront area becomes a crossing ground and a central spine rather than a barrier. And then the second thing that happens is as you walk north-south around the waterfront, rather than being part of this monotonous sort of single channel of space, you're crossing a lot of different things, and they're all extensions of so many different streets and neighborhoods. We have so many great things to work with to extend. The scale breaks down at any edge in nature. You get more surface area, a finer particle size. This is also what should happen here in the waterfront. Our building blocks should break down as you get closer to the edge. They should be finer scaled. This will also allow the entire downtown to feel like a waterfront because the waterfront district will feel pervious. The other thing that needs to happen is our framework of mobility and our streets also needs to break down into a finer scale. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't have cars on the waterfront, but it does mean that we have more crossings and we divide our infrastructure up into finer scaled pieces rather than one singular oversized barrier. This creates the opportunity for so many different types of public spaces that we really enjoy designing, from different types of streets to pedestrian corridors that might not have cars on them, especially some of these east-west ones that come from the sort of cliff conditions, and accommodations for bicycles. And at the terminus of those streets, overlooks and crossings and different types of social spaces.
So we are famous for City of Neighborhoods. And this is more than just about removing the viaduct. It's about reconnecting, re-energizing, reactivating our city. Starting with the neighborhoods, there are great opportunities in each one. Here we can reconnect the waterfront with rail transit. We can re-energize the downtown with more of that ferry boat energy. We can take away those concrete barriers and turn those into people places. There's a great place in our city, a sort of wedge shape that connects the retail core, Pike Place Market, and the aquarium. It's got great ways to get down through there. They're not always easy to find, and we have lots of opportunities to make more of them, varied ways of getting up and down with the joy of moving up and down the hill. This is in Belltown, up on that cliff, and the cliff offers great viewpoints. It's challenging getting up and down that hill. We've been talking with the Belltown about the opportunities when the viaduct goes down. And there are great new opportunities for them. They're very excited about Battery Street with a viewpoint that's about the same size, although it's very sloped, as Steinbrook Park. You can see and imagine the great views for that community. Streets are a big deal, and Belltown, we talk about those a lot too, with the green streets that are just beginning to finally be green after so many years. So what is the new Alaskan Way going to be? How do we make an Alaskan Way for the city of the future? What is it volumetrically? How do you get all the different modes to work at once? And the city is doing better. Those are starting to appear. But these east-west connections are part of our project. We've got Columbia and Seneca that are going to be new people places when we get rid of these. And there's lots of various ways to do that. GGN and our firm have been working with Cornish College of the Arts on Terry Avenue. There's now just 12 feet of concrete there. There's going to be plazas for the students and new gardens. Shannon and I worked on one of the city's first street master plans for Terry Avenue North, and we were asked by SDOT to get as close as possible to a European-style Vonerf. And so we started looking at how we could cluster things rather than just make linear streets. We could cluster pedestrian places for plazas. We could cluster landscape for large species and cluster the parking so it's less intrusive. And here it is. It's being built out, as many of you know, with Amazon.com. There's a streetcar, and it's really fun to see new ways of thinking about streets. We're a three-dimensional city. It's one of our great quirks as a city. So it means we've got promenades and views, we've got eddies of space as people tumble down the hill, we've got the drama and joy of moving up and down with tower and bridge, we've got ever-changing viewpoints as you move up and down the hill. Those are things that we need to magnify and make sure that Seattle is more of who we are. So there's infill opportunities, and infill is when you bring old and new together. It's another way of knitting things together. And there's opportunity to do this, especially as Alaskan Way moves back from that wonderful historic building stock that we're very excited about as the edge to this new space. We've got some hard-earned knowledge doing that. It's a wonderful thing to bring old and new together because the future really has both the old and the new together in a good way.
As we all felt in 2001, we live on shifting ground. In order to provide an ecologically healthy waterfront, we need to understand the forces that created it and the stories that are contained within the landscape. The entire Puget Sound region is a huge, huge ecosystem, and everything is interrelated, it's interconnected. So we cannot design the waterfront without understanding these forces. If you begin to look down at the Elliott Bay, and you can really see the north-south glacial footprint of when the glaciers came in, ebbed and flowed, and carved out what we now know as our city, and carved out this deep port of Elliott Bay. And this is what an ecological edge looks like. This is how we're going to create stronger connections, stronger health along the waterfront. We're going to provide diversity of materials. We're going to allow flows to move along it and through it. This is going to be a healthy waterfront that tells a story of the region and the city.
So what does that story look like? We're going to have a seawall that has surface area. This is taking that interaction down to the finest scale, using salvaged materials to increase the surface texture and scale. It's about our native ecology and the chance to actually experience it when you come to Seattle rather than trees from Ohio. It's about the central open space and rediscovering where the edge of the water should feel like it is, even if it isn't literally. And that's about rediscovering our bluff. It's a really cool topographical feature that most cities don't have. That is where the ritual of arriving at the water should start, at least conceptually and experientially. We've landlocked our piers. We need to undo that. We need to create this sort of setting on the waterfront that feels like it's an extension of the bay, even if you are on land. And we're quite excited about the hybrid of urban and marine and park type of space that can create simply by being very thoughtful about materials that we're choosing and respecting the presence of the water. All that adds up to something that might look something like that.
So, healthy city, what does that mean? We have an opportunity here to mend a piece of Seattle to make it a really vibrant urban realm.
It's very important that the city makes sustainable decisions at this urban scale. Seattle's been very environmentally conscious, but it's not performing as well as it could. We want to talk about walkable cities and neighborhoods that have all these elements, and you can see how many of those could be on our waterfront.
Diversity of scale. We're not the same. We need different kinds of spaces.
In Stockholm, a project that we're working on, Stockholm is very much like Seattle, a beautiful city with incredible urban realm. But there's a mending that needed to take place by removing this incredible concrete barrier in the middle of the city, redesigning the transport, bringing people back to the river. But it also meant bringing a little bit of the city back to the river, at a scale of 6 stories, just enough to take the character of the city to the water's edge and also to create plazas of different scales. And this project in Germany is quite interesting in that it's an infill project, very careful, in an old industrial area. And what it's done by bringing mixed use and bringing people who live and work in the same place is that there's an incredible amount of liveliness there.
But the diversity of scale and also can be just places you capture. It can be narrow places, just from one area to another. It can be very small areas that you make intimate to make it comfortable for certain people. Mobility is very important for the sustainable city. I keep saying, I want to go to work and never get behind a wheel.
In Trafalgar Square, some of you may know, it was completely landlocked, empty, and full of pigeons. We made a very simple move, which was to pedestrianize the north side and add one stair. That move completely changed the nature of that space from being full of traffic to becoming part of the heart of the city, which is now a space for events every weekend, and no one could imagine it another way. Another strategic move is the Millennium Bridge. It's brought people across the river, connected two different parts of the city, and totally energized the south side of the river. A very different project that looks at mobility in a different way is Masdar, a zero-energy, zero-carbon, zero-waste city in Abu Dhabi under construction. That uses electric personal rapid transit individual vehicles, but it's also integrated with the infrastructure and the pedestrian realm at the scale of that walking neighborhood.
Towards mobility need to live hand in hand, whether it's bicycle and pedestrian or just the simple mobility of moving across and not creating barriers so we can get very fluid movement through the site. If you're going to have a livable city, you have to have places for kids, and I'm not saying one, I mean many, and for different ages and different sizes, and very accessible to families. Places that are safe for kids to play, where they're away from cars, they can bask in nature, they can discover water. Also fitness. If you don't stay fit, you can't work. If you can't work, you can't pay the rent and you can't eat. So it's a really important part of our life. Ecology, sustainability. How do we bring ecology into natural environment? This is a project I'm working on in Singapore. It's right in the center of the heart of Singapore. It's a mile-long waterfront that's the average of about 3 football fields wide. We're introducing photovoltaic water taxis to connect it to parts of the city. We're also treating all the development water around with 5 acres of natural filtering systems. We're also integrating new food gardens that are growing local foods and showing you how to raise it and cook it. But you don't have to do this at a big scale. You can do really small pieces that look at how do you bring your environment to your children and to the public so that they understand the fragility of that environment. Activation is really important.
And we need people there day and night, living and working, so our streets and our parks are safe.
And that can be just a connection to two places, or that can be an area where you just want to sit and think for a while. Art and culture are very important. Art and culture bring different people from diverse together that normally wouldn't be together. It creates places that are festive. Happy people are generous people. Making places for people is very important in educational places with the art. Events, how do you bring people together socially? An event space needs to be drop dead beautiful when it's empty, but it also has to function when it's full. So,
thank you, Catherine. We're ready to take your questions.
Can I say one last thing?
You may.
Thank you. I appreciate
You're welcome.
it. This is an opportunity. It's an opportunity. Seattle is a really great place to live. It needs to be the best place to live. It needs to be the place that is a global example of what can bring our environment and our culture together. That there is an importance that I love what Joseph Albert says about design. He says, just do it better. Don't do it different. And I think it's a little bit easy, and we all think it's easy, to just take a little bit of sustainability, what I call some happy programming with the new trendy. But that is not what's going to make your city. We need to take great care in innovation and make a city where you wake up in the morning feeling energized, smart, and generous. And that's our goal.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Catherine. Now we'll take your questions.
To begin our discussion, using examples from your best work, Can you please share some stories about how public process has reshaped your design?
Absolutely. In Boston, we worked on a project called North End Parks, and it was part of the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which is the lid over the Big Dig Tunnel. And it certainly is a project that is very different from this one and has been looked at for important lessons that we can bring about what to do and what not to do here. North End Parks, we came into the project hearing nightmare stories about landscape architects and architects being run out of the community, this North End community, and a wonderful Italian-American community that was adjacent to the parks. And we came in very humble, and we didn't want to bring any designs. We didn't do any design, and came in with just information. And we weren't sure what they were going to think about it. We showed them how excited we were about the topographical history of the site and some of the unique qualities of this void between their neighborhood and the city. And part of what we brought in was an excitement about the colonial history there. The Freedom Trail runs through the site, and we thought, well, the business owners, I'm sure will really want to reinstate the Freedom Trail and really emphasize that. And two things happened. One, the sort of exciting part was that the neighborhood really embraced us because they were so appreciative that we paid so much attention to their site. And that we weren't coming in with designs. And that was sort of just the good background part. And we ended up having a blast, and I think probably really lucked out being with that neighborhood because they were so passionate about wanting to use the space. But the aspect of the design that changed was they surprised us by saying, all we hear about is colonial history. People, we're trying to live our daily lives. There's tourists walking through. There's people in Paul Revere outfits. We really don't want this park to be about colonial history. And in fact, they wanted it to be about things that we didn't dare propose. They said, we want it to be about Italian-American heritage. We want some columns in there and we want some marble and things like that. And so it gave us this really specific and kind of peculiar thing to put together that we're really proud of, and we think that it's very much embedded in the neighborhood, and the Friends of the North End Parks group formed before the project was even finished.
As you well know, the Central Waterfront project is adjacent to two major infrastructure projects, the seawall and Alaskan Way. America's infrastructure is crumbling, and much infrastructure design in the past half-century has been bland and utilitarian. How will the design team integrate, express, and reveal the infrastructure as an element within the designs, particularly the seawall?
Well, the seawall is so exciting, and I think I'd also ask Chris West to come in after me because he has great experience turning infrastructure into cultural surfaces. The seawall right now is this singular gesture, and it's this line that runs north-south. It's a rigid piece of infrastructure, and I'd like to call it an exoskeleton because the infrastructure component of it is what we see and interact with on the surface of it. It's also a single function piece. It's singularly been designed and shaped to protect the city, which is an important function. It's not apparently doing it very well right now, but our fingers are crossed until it gets replaced. But it needs to become this flexible condition that, kind of like some of our slides, thinks more east-west than north-south, and becomes a series of sections east-west at every street that intersects with it, and a different space that we start to think about facing the waterfront and facing the city. There's some great opportunities for that, particularly as you move north and south away from where the piers are. We get more and more opportunities with the shallower approach of the topography or the bathymetry to the seawall, and some more space to potentially rake it back to provide some variety.
Just like other aspects of this project, the seawall itself should react to the guiding principles. And there's so many constraints on this project all around the site. But any good design will be universal enough to deal with those constraints. And so even though there isn't a lot of time, I think we can be quite strategic about the points on the seawall that we feel need to do the kinds of things that you were saying, and still be able to progress in a design, because any solution that's really going to be good is going to have to gather up and deal with all those different conditions, and especially the ecology.
So this question from the audience anticipates the natural extension of the last question. Given convincing and credible projections about the impact of climate change on sea level, how will your design thinking take into account the possibility of sea level rise in the design for the central waterfront?
Sure. Yeah, great.
The Slusen project that we showed was generated because of this, and I think many cities are finding the opportunity that as infrastructure decays, you can use the replacement to deal with all these issues, especially, great urban design. But in Slusen, they were dealing with water subsidence underneath, and also very varying levels. It's a lock, so it's similar to what is in Seattle, where there's fresh water and salt water. And to deal with the changing levels, which were quite radical there, required the rebuilding of the whole thing. So I think there are just so many opportunities to deal with all these different kinds of issues as they come up.
This is also about integrating with the seawall engineering team that's already at work. And I know that they're designing in anticipation of the last round of models that are showing a 6-inch rise in sea level over the next 40 years. That's something that's going to affect the amount of potential rise that we have at the end of the seawall, and it does affect some sort of grading relationship things, even though it doesn't sound like a lot of, maybe a foot or two. There are some places in the waterfront where the foot of the face of the buildings, particularly towards Pioneer Square, feel like they're lower than the top of the seawall. And so there's going to be some really interesting grading exercises and very careful work that needs to be done that still allow you to feel like you're descending and sort of easily flowing toward the water, even when you may not be above it in all places.
The real question is, can we keep that 6 inches from happening? And that is about what we do now and what we do ecologically now. How do we reduce our heat gain? How do we reduce our carbon? And so part of the answer is today, and trying to figure out, do we get bigger canopy in here? We've lost a great amount of trees in Seattle. Then different elements and different ways in the design and dialogue with all of the public about how do we reduce this? How do we get away that we don't have to deal with these 6 inches?
As you well know, as lovers of the city, we have the great gift of highly successful open urban space in Seattle Art Museum's Olympic Sculpture Park, Seattle Center, and emerging in South Lake Union. As you reflect on the possibilities of the central waterfront design, could you describe some opportunities you might see to connect and vivify these great urban spaces, particularly given the scale of the central waterfront project?
Well, we're so excited about that one. We encounter, and this isn't just about tourism, it's about our ability to find that sort of other scale of movement in our city for recreation and for practical movement every day. But we do encounter tourists every day outside of our pier, and they're always asking how to get to the Space Needle. Then they proceed to walk down along the viaduct, and then you hear them coming the other direction and saying, oh man, I'm glad I don't live in the city. And it makes us think about the importance of providing people with a very high quality experience between those dots on our map. And there's been all sorts of plans over the years about how to connect them. From our Foursquare streetcar plan, the monorail plan in a way was addressing that. But what the waterfront is, it's not only the lighthouse to lighthouse connection that we've all been talking about for years, really connecting West Seattle to Discovery Park, but it's also about that Foursquare macro scale landscape that could run through our city and be a really interesting alternative to having a central green space. We like to move in Seattle. As Catherine said, we really enjoy fitness and the ability to have experience that gets us away from a normal cityscape for a little bit. And that green loop, particularly if Broad Street is capitalized as an opportunity on the other end, to link the sculpture park with the South Lake Union Park, holds great potential. So certainly, I guess the short answer to that is we keep talking about the east-west because it's what we're most concerned about right now, and making sure those east-west connections you're really experiencing them as a series of crossings. But we also understand that that north-south experience must still be connected at that larger scale.
It's a really interesting the way that the topography works, that you have this opportunity that every street is another experience because it doesn't go down the same way. And every connection, whether you go east-west, you start at Pioneer Square, you're flush with the buildings, and as you move north, all of a sudden you have, this bluff that comes down, and then you have the sculpture park. I think that diversity of space is what makes it interesting, so that you're constantly discovering and moving through it. And I think really taking advantage of diversity of space and making that journey be really fascinating.
And also, I think that it's going to be really important that we look for those moments of maximum potential for artists to sort of interpret some of those sites. And I think the great strength of this project is that it's the scale of the land that we'll be working on is large, but we're talking about a breakdown at a much finer scale. And so we'll have some medium and large spaces, but we're going to have really dozens and dozens of fantastic public spaces, and particularly, say, between piers. There's these amazing views where you're, both of your vision is oriented straight out towards the bay, and those are really rich locations. And you'll have your back to the city and a really incredible landscape inside of that.
Catherine, your last question inspires my last question. Among the lead team finalists for this project, your team is singular in its intimacy with the Seattle waterfront for all the reasons that you've presented this evening. I'm wondering how, within your design process, you guarantee the opportunity for fresh insight and a fresh sense of discovery and access to the kind of wonder that comes from one's encounter with a site that's unfamiliar.
I think that for me, then I know for Shannon and Chris, who I work with quite a bit, that as a designer, we're curious. We're very curious, and anything that you can discover just makes our life better. I mean, it's sort of like, oh, I got a new tidbit here. What else can I do? So that's sort of always my motto for myself and for pretty much everybody I work with. Oh, you can do that, but what else? What's that next step? What's that next piece of discovery? What's that next thing that's going to make me feel like we're actually moving forward? We were talking with Chris this morning, and we are being given a brain for some reason, but I think it's to evolve and get better. And so if, taking down the viaduct is about making a better city, but I think that discovery of what that is going to be and every different opportunity and talking to people who are going to bring in new insights. You may be from the city, but you have this designer head that somehow you were born with, and that makes you just very, very curious about things.
And also, we are from this city. This is our town, and this is our chance to make a contribution to this unique environment. And many of us have been contributing heavily in this process all along, and we are here to listen, and we will be here every day. And one important aspect of our approach is that we're going to establish a public gallery so that all of the design work that we generate is going to be posted on the wall, and that gallery will be down on the waterfront in Pioneer Square, and we will also develop our own website for the waterfront plan so that people can post and respond and we can react. And we will be listening, and we will be here in Seattle. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, I think need everybody over years to do this. We can, oh, sorry. We can, we can do a design and we can have an international and local team, but we need everyone in Seattle to work on this because it's a framework and a design, and that framework is going to take years to build out and to grow and evolve and get better over time. So we need everybody's viewpoints, and we need to crystallize that as a design team, but we need to be both local and to be very, very good listeners.
Ladies and gentlemen, help me thank Gustafson, Guthrie, Nickel, and team.